Good morning and a very warm welcome to this EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jackie Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me this week, as always, Fabian Zulig, Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the EPC, Yanis Emmanuelidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies at the EPC, and our special guest this week, delighted to welcome back Ricardo Borges de Castro, EPC Associate Director and Head of the Europe in the World programme, as we discuss what impact this year of elections, with voters in some 64 countries plus the EU representing around half of the world's populations go to the polls. What impact will all those votes have on the EU27, and also what impact will the wider geopolitical developments have? As always, this is a totally interactive conversation. I have some questions for our panel, and then if you want to ask a question, as always, two ways of doing it. Click on the raised hands button if you would like to take the floor, and I will unmute you when the time comes, or write your question in the Q&A box, not the chat, the Q&A, and please be as brief as possible. Right, we have an enormous amount of ground to cover today. We're going to be focusing a lot of our discussion this morning on a paper that the EPC published last week. It's called the Outlook paper. It is entitled Europe in the World in 2024, From Voting to Geopolitics. If you haven't taken a look, I do urge you to do so, but we will delve into some of its content during our discussions this morning. Yanis, let me start with you and the primary focus of our discussions today in the title of the event, elections. As I mentioned, about half the world's population going to the polls. Which are the ones that we need to watch from an EU perspective, i.e. the ones that potentially could have the biggest impact on Europe? Yeah.
Well, this is actually really a difficult question. And I'm sure that whatever answer we now give, it will be wrong, because we will in retrospect know which elections have been the most significant, because there will be consequences of many of these elections. However, if you now ask me which ones are the most significant to look at, I think there are two which are the most obvious candidates when it comes to the EU. One are the European elections in June, which obviously will have an effect, by the way, both at the European level, but I think also at the national level. Then the second most obvious answer is the elections in the US. We already see how much we're concentrating, thinking about them, also fearing them. Some even say that we're panicking given the perspective that Trump might come back to power. I'm not saying he will, and I'm sure we're going to discuss it, but the US election already are making their mark. They're influencing heavy discussions which are happening in Europe, and they should, by the way, independent of its outcome. And the last elections I would mention, which might not seem as obvious as the other two, are three German regional elections in three Bundesländer in September in the eastern part of Germany, where chances are very high that the AfD will do very well. We do not know how well they will do, but chances are extremely high that they will do well, and we do not know what that consequences would be, but they have the potential to really shake up the debate with a debate which already has been shaken up in Germany about the influence of the AfD on national policy making, but also European policy making. So I think one should also have these in mind, because they would, if things work out very negatively, have strong effects not only in Germany, but also at the European level.
Thank you. Fabian, would you highlight those three? Anything else we need to be watching closely?
I think the general picture is one of global volatility. So this is something where we really have to be watching everything. I agree with Yanis that these are significant elections, but clearly we also have the Russian election, if we can call it that. Yes, it is a foregone conclusion, but it'll be interesting to see how exactly that runs. We have the Indian election, the biggest democracy in the world. There's a lot happening all over the place. But I think in terms of the most immediate consequences, I would personally highlight very much the US elections, because that potential of a very polarized outcome, I think, is something which doesn't only have an impact on the broader political future of the European Union, but it has a direct bearing on our security situation and on what happens in Ukraine.
We'll come back on both of those a little bit later on. But Ricardo, if I could bring you in here, and the Outlook paper does look at those elections. It talks about the potential, the geopolitical implications of those elections. It also talks about the question of whether this will become an inflection point. 2025 could, it says, be an inflection point, and one of the factors there would be these elections. But beyond that as well, the paper also warns, and I quote, the gradual shift of global politics from a predominant model of cooperation to one of competition, confrontation, or even conflict is most likely to continue throughout 2024. Apart from the elections, because we'll come back on that in a minute, Ricardo, what does the paper highlight as the most important global actors and regions and the sort of flashpoints, challenges we should be looking at?
Sure. Thank you, Jack, and thank you for inviting me. Indeed, I mean, the paper does reflect a lot about elections. I mean, as we say in the paper, it's an electoral year on steroids, which will bring some of this volatility that Fabian and Yanis were just mentioning. I mean, we cover, some key actors that we have done in all editions. So the US, China, Russia, Ukraine, Turkey. So these are countries that we normally tend to cover. I think then regionally, we have also looked into the Indo-Pacific. Also, the MENA region is also normally the Indo-Pacific and the MENA region are always there. And this year we have a look into, we put a spotlight on Latin America. I mean, Latin America is a really important continent, especially now in the context of Europe's, drive for economic security and diversification. It seems that Latin America becomes important when there is a president of the Commission that is Portuguese or a high representative that is Spanish. It shouldn't be like that. It should be something that is consistent. And so in previous years, we had Africa, we had Global South. So we tried to bring a new region into the spotlight. In terms of the flashpoints, we have looked a lot into the seas. So the Black Sea, the Red Sea, the South China Sea, sort of to try to basically to highlight that there might be some problems in some of these areas that could actually put a further stress into the issues that let's say the West, the so-called West, is trying to deal, the US and Europe. I mean, there's also a very important contribution from Shada Islam on Afghanistan and what lessons can we take from women's rights policy for the EU, given the experience of Afghanistan. Or let's say on the policy issues, and very briefly, I mean, there is a trend that we are observing of securitization. I mean, and if you listen to President von der Leyen's speech today in the European Parliament, was all about securitization on many different policy areas, particularly security and defense, because that was her pitch this morning. But also then we look into key issues that are bound to be also debated during the European Parliament elections. So everything that has to do with the EU social contract and social issues, and how Europeans are facing sort of the many manifestations of the perma crisis. Also, migration and asylum, which is a key aspect that I think many Europeans are concerned about. And also there's a potential to be explored by the more extreme political parties in the spectrum. And also artificial intelligence. We wanted to put a spotlight there because it's a key issue. And then naturally we have covered security and defense and enlargement, which we also have been doing over the past few years. And then we also end with a list of elections a little bit everywhere, where people can sort of track what is happening and where. Yep.
Wow, a lot of richness, a lot to dig into. I want to come back on not all, because we won't have time, but many of those points in a moment. But you referred there to Ursula von der Leyen, and I just wanted to ask, and Fabian, in terms of what the Commission President said when she announced she was running for a second term, what she said since, how do you see the way she is trying to, if you like, frame the next 5 years, what her brand would be for a von der Leyen 2, as it were, and what she's likely to focus on in her campaign for a second term? What did you read into it? She seems to be trying to walk several tightropes.
Well, as always at this stage of the process, of course, she's walking various tightropes, because she has to convince various different constituencies that she is really the only choice for continuation. I think what we're seeing is a look at the parliament and at particular political groupings, what they are emphasizing, a look at a number of member states and their priorities. But the reality clearly is that she is very much in the middle of this geopolitical storm. All of the things we have been talking about are going to affect the next presidency. And for all of these, there will have to be some form of response from the Commission and in particular the Commission President. I think in that context, it's also interesting to look at the Council President. I think it's important that we're not losing sight of that key role and the cooperation which has to be there between the Commission and the European Council. But I think what are the key priorities? I mean, clearly there's some continuity, but what will be very much on the agenda is defense. That has already been announced with a defense commissioner being planned by Ursula von der Leyen. And I think the other issue, which is also coming out of the difficulties of the German economy, is competitiveness. How is Europe going to compete in this much more difficult, no longer multilateral environment?
And can I just ask you as a follow-up, Fabian, before I come to Yanis on this point, this debate about competitiveness, there are people who are suggesting that that means a backtracking on the Green Deal, that there is pressure to backtrack on the Green Deal. Do you read it like that? Or do you think she can walk this line between continuing with what was the central core theme of her first term as president into the second term, or are we really talking about a shift away? How do you read that?
Well, I think from the perspective of the Commission and the Commission President in particular, I think there will be an argument that essentially that part has been done. I mean, clearly there are still some elements which need to be addressed. But the big legislative packages have by and large gone through. There's very little left of that. So I think the message will be not that this is not a priority anymore, but this is not necessarily the biggest area of focus anymore, because we have now been able to move on and to focus on other areas. But I think what is in the background is a political reality. And that political reality is that the pressure of the populists is going to focus most probably on three areas: migration and identity, as always, which will continue. It will focus also increasingly on support to Ukraine and the consequences that has on many different policy areas. But the third one, and I think that has already been emerging, including in the EPP, is this question of how decisive should we be on climate change in particular, i.e. who is going to bear the cost for this transition. And I think that pressure she's trying to balance out. But she can also not go completely the other way, because that would play what she has achieved, undermine her legacy, but also it risks, of course, losing the Greens. And given that the central majority is
so much ground to cover, but thank you, Fabian. Yanis, would you share that analysis of what she said so far, and where do you think she will focus during the campaign?
Well, first of all, it was no surprise that she is now running for the office after it was clear that the NATO SecGen job is going somewhere else. It was clear that she will concentrate her efforts on getting the second 5 years, and that won't be easy. But let's not forget, in 2019, the election result in the European Parliament was very close, extremely close. Depending on how the outcome of the EP elections will be, we will have a more fragmented European Parliament. And we have a situation in which member states, not only among themselves, but also within themselves, have a lot of differences of opinion, different priorities, different interests, competing priorities. So it will be much more difficult this time probably than it was also than it was in 2019. And at the same time, she also needs to handle the fact that she is Commission President while she's also campaigning to become the next Commission President. And we saw with what she said when campaigning about Ukraine and next steps happening after the European elections, and then when she spoke as Commission President saying we will work on things before that. So all that shows you how difficult it will be for her to operate. And that makes me think that she will try to please everyone and that she will have to please everyone. So yes, there will be a focus on defense. We clearly see that. It's also something, by the way, which comes from the German context and from her mother party, the CDU. So let's not forget that. But at the same time, she also has to please everyone else. So it will be a mixture of all the different things, including those which have been on the agenda in future, and also some new elements. And I fear that at the end of the day, like my general fear is that we will not have a clear prioritization of what is more important and what is less, but that we rather will try to go in between and muddle ourselves through. Also, she will have to reflect what the strategic agenda comes up with, so what the European heads of state and government will agree to, which again will be very eclectic and trying to find compromises given all the differences of all member states. And she will have to maneuver herself through to September, October, when she needs a majority in the European Parliament.
Thank you. Ricardo, as I mentioned earlier, your paper, the Outlook paper, says this could have potential geopolitical implications for Europe's global role. Why, in what way do you think the European elections could impact on that? And how do you think they might affect the priorities looking at that geopolitical context?
Yeah, I think a lot has already been said by Fabian and Yanis, but I think what the European Parliament elections also can bring is that what kind of MEPs are they going to bring into the European Parliament? Also, what is their knowledge on these issues, on, let's say, from trade to Russia to China to all the issues that we have to deal with? Is there knowledge enough also within the European Parliament to actually think and actually be able to develop good policies in these areas? So I think that and then of course the configuration of the European Parliament, the way that, as Yanis was alluding to, that if it becomes more fragmented, everything else would be more difficult to do. And we know, for example, that trade deals are not, if anything, they're not becoming more popular, they're becoming less popular. And so if the numbers also of skepticals on trade, for example, increase in the European Parliament, this will put also more difficulty there. So I think the configuration of the European Parliament is relevant in this regard. Also, let's imagine that you have a situation that there is some sort of paralysis in the European, let's say, after the elections, where whereby they're unable to elect a president of the Commission. Let's put sort of an extreme scenario that this does happen, and it happens very close then to the American elections, as Europe is fighting a war, or a war has been fought in European territory. So the potential for, let's say, for uncertainty, for volatility, it's quite high from these elections as well. But we might still have, let's say, that arch of consensus between the socialists, the EPP, the Greens, and the Liberals might be able to move to things forward. Yeah.
Indeed. And Yanis, let me come back to you, because you talked about that fragmented parliament. We have seen predictions that the nationalist right, the far right, could get a quarter of the seats. But some people, I remember previous elections, particularly the last one, where people said, we will have a parliament that is unable to function, it will be too fragmented. Are we crying wolf when we say that now? That arch of consensus Ricardo just talked about, do you believe it can hold in these circumstances? Or is it really different this time, as some people are saying? How do you see the consequences for the EU's ability to function?
Well, first of all, you're right. In 2018-19, there were a lot of people who were saying the parliament will become more fragmented, will be dominated by the right. And at the end of the day, this was not the case as much as the fears had been before, which had largely to do, by the way, with the fact that there was a high participation rate, turnout, much higher than it had been in the EP elections over the past decades, because there had been a negative trend and that had been reversed 2019. And the question mark for me is what will happen this year? And I think this is not a foregone conclusion as to how big of a turnout we will have. because it could be, and here potentially the US Trump factor might play into the equation, that people will say it really matters what happens also with respect to the EP elections. That's what was the case in 2019. But then again, you see in a lot of debates in member states that there's very much a focus on national issues. There's not a strong focus on what the EU plays in terms of its role when it comes to issues which people are and care about. So we have to see what the outcome will be. But there will be an outcome where the right will be stronger. Well, you will have a stronger fragmentation because this is the general trend in the member states. So that is irrespective of what is happening at the European level. But and by the way, because you said crying wolf, I think that this parliament, the 2019-24 parliament, is weaker than the previous parliament had been. And I would assume that the next parliament will also be weaker in terms of its institutional role in the overall configuration of the European Union. So depending on the outcome and how much of a fragmentation will we have, how much the success of the right-wing parties will be, that will also then determine the role of the European Parliament in the interinstitutional setting. Having said all that, there's a question, and that it really is a question, it worries a good number of people, of how much cooperation you will see among the right-wing parties in the European Parliament. In the past, we've seen that they had been struggling when it comes to cooperating because they have a strong national focus, because they have certain differences when it comes to major issues. So it's difficult for them to align themselves. But it could be that this time around, so in the next parliament, that there will be more structural cooperation among right-wing parties, especially if they are better positioned in the European Parliament, in the next European Parliament, than they have been thus far. So there are reasons to be worried without over-dramatizing it.
Thank you. Ricardo seems to be having a few technical issues here, flashing on and off. Hopefully he will be back with us there he is. Very good. Fabian, your assessment of the degree to which this fragmentation could paralyze the EU, as some suggest, or can be contained. What do you see as the implications?
I think there is a very real risk. I would agree with Yannis. Also because I think we should not only focus on what happens in the parliament. The important aspect of this is also what impact do these kind of results have on domestic politics, and how does that then reflect back onto the European level? And I think what we are going to see is that if the far right, if the anti-parties, the populists are very successful, there will be a political reaction in many countries, also because, as we have seen in the past, there will be protest votes, there will be a judgment being passed on the governments in many countries. So I think what we're going to see is that more generally, and this goes very much in line with Ricardo's analysis of the global situation, is we are moving away from cooperation to something which is much more contested, much more conflictual, much more difficult. And that means that when it comes to big policy objectives, when it comes to decisive action, it is much less likely that the next parliament, but also the next political system as a whole, is able to function effectively.
Thank you. Let's move to the US elections now. And Ricardo, a question from our audience, from Emmanuel Dragov, talking about the outcome of elections, saying, do we pay enough attention to this in the EU or too much attention? The paper talks about things the EU needs to do to prepare, Ricardo, for the potential of a Trump 2. It also points out there are some implications that are not entirely positive of a Biden 2. But in terms of the influence the US elections could have on our geopolitical role, our global role, and those ideas that the paper contains for preparing, I think you seem to be suggesting building other channels to keep communications up between the EU and US if we have a Trump 2. Your assessment of, are we paying too much attention to this or too little?
I mean, I think we probably were paying too much attention to it, and we are doing too little to prepare for it. And I think that this is something that we, I mean, I think there was a phase of anxiety about what might be the outcome of the election. And I think now the system, or at least the conversations that I'm having, the discussions that are happening, seems to be more, okay, how can we prepare for this? and be better prepared. I mean, on one hand, I think we have gone through a first Trump presidency, and so that should already tell us a little bit what are his instincts and inclinations when he's in power or governing. Of course, I mean, what you also hear from most people that you speak with is that this presidency, if he were to get a second mandate, it will be much more destructive or much more revengeful than the first one was, because now he has a lot of payback to do, not only internally. So I think domestic politics might become also very messy within the US, and that of course will have a reflection outside. But then I believe that he will also have a very the policy, he will pick targets as he has done in the past. I think the EU was always in his sights. Also, I think Germany is going to be probably a favorite candidate for him to pick on because of trade, because of defense expenditure. I mean, you could name several other instances why he might want to do that. But I think also, as we also put in the paper, I mean, a Biden presidency will also not be just a rosy presidency for Europeans, because I mean, the list of irritants between both sides that go from trade to technology to the IRA, to the Inflation Reduction Act, and so on. I think these are issues that are still there and that have not been fully resolved. I mean, I think on the key issue, which will be Ukraine and security, and I think this is where a lot of people are concerned. I think if we have a Biden presidency, I mean, the likelihood that he will still be on board in supporting Ukraine is very high. Of course, he might need to deal with a very complicated Congress. I think if we are talking about Mr. Trump, I think his instinct will be to force a peace deal with Russia. I think he's going to push the Ukrainians to cede the territory, and I think this is just going to put us all in a very tight spot. I mean, I think for us Europeans, and to answer to part of the question, I think, I mean, irrespective of who is in the US, as Europeans, we need to decide what are the things that we need to do. I mean, from energy security to defense and security to competitiveness, as Fabian was referring to. What are the things that we need to do, and just do it, and do it by ourselves. In the eventuality that we're going to need to do it alone. So I think this is something that we should just be preparing for that. I think we already lost a little bit of time. It's time to speed up.
Yanis, a lot of doom mongering about this, but not enough action. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I think that Ricardo is right. I think, first of all, we do not know what the outcome of the elections will be. And I would not make a prognosis now that there will be Trump too. So what we're talking about is what would happen in case, and there's still a lot of time from now until November. So let's be careful when giving a prognosis. From today's perspective, I think that it's probably still more likely that a Biden 2 will become reality rather than a Trump 2. But saying that, I again repeat, we need to be extremely careful. But if there would be a Trump 2, I think the negative expectations from a global perspective and from a European perspective, by the way, also from a US perspective, cannot be underestimated. So my expectations would be expect the worst. Because yes, there is the revenge aspect that Ricardo already mentioned, both internally but also at the external level globally. But there's also the fact that you will have an administration which will be much more prepared for assuming power, and that you will have less people within the administration who will balance out Trump, because last time around, they actually themselves didn't believe that they would come to power. Now that they are much more prepared, and also good number of think tanks doing their job to help them prepare for that. So you cannot underestimate the potential negative consequences of a Trump 2. What I wonder about is us, because end of last year, beginning of this year, it was not only that the fears grew what would happen if the outcome of the election in the US would lead to Trump 2, but it was not only fear, and that's why we used the word earlier, panic. There was a panic of what potentially the consequences are if he would come to power, what that would mean, especially with respect to Ukraine, especially with respect to our relationship with Russia. And I wonder myself, why do we now panic? I think the latest moment where we should have realized that there are dangers in front of us which can be of a certain nature that will really put us fundamentally under pressure, was on the 24th of February of 2022, so a bit more than 2 years ago. And now we fear that. So what that tells me is that all these exercises we do in terms of foresight, trying to have an idea about potentially what could happen and prepare ourselves for that moment of truth, potentially also to avoid that moment of truth, by the way, is actually not working at the European level. So I think there are reasons to be worried, but I don't understand why we aren't now realizing that there are reasons to be worried. And by the way, as Ricardo was already indicating, if it's Biden too, the world will not be rosy just because of that.
Not. Indeed not. Fabian, if you agree that we need to prepare and we need to prepare now, what do we need to be doing? And an intriguing question from Aeon Young Pak from our audience saying, how do you assess the implications of the forecast for now US presidential election on EU politics and policies? Given that the US elections take place after the European elections, would you assess that just a mere forecast of the probability that Trump would return to power could impact on the EU elections and voters in member states? So bringing the link between the two elections, is there one? Do you see one? But first, how should we be preparing?
Well, I think preparing has to start with a bit more strategic thinking. We have to start at a European level, not just at a national level, but at a European level, to start talking about what is it we need to do. And how would that then be affected by a Trump presidency, or likely be affected, because clearly there's a lot of uncertainty as well. But there are some things which we already know we will have to do even with the Biden administration. So if we are talking about preparation, one of the things we should have been doing, and that is very much along the lines of what Yannis is saying, is, for example, we should have had a much more serious discussion around defense and security. We should have talked about how are we going to address the sector, how are we going to deal with the implications of a more European response on these issues in areas such as export control, etc. I mean, these are all things we could have done. And we know we are going to have to do them in any case. So I think there's a lot which can still be done. But that's not to underestimate how much of a catastrophe Trump 2 administration would be for Europe.
Indeed.
Because we are talking about someone who doesn't only have issues with certain policies of Europeans, we're talking about someone who is very much out to destroy the European Union. And the biggest challenge for us is going to be, how do we maintain coherence? How do we maintain unity in the face of such a challenge?
Thank you. And there's a question related to that from Paul Taylor, Ricardo, saying, is a Trump 2 administration likely to unite Europeans, or more likely that each member state would seek bilateral deals with Trump, especially in Central Europeans? Going to have to ask you for fairly short answers now. We've got lots of questions coming in and lots more ground to discuss.
I think he could potentially empower some of the populists that are already there, and some of them in power, like people like Mr. Orban might feel empowered, and that I think it could have a negative impact on unity within Europe. And I think also a lot of it will depend on which policies we're talking about. If we're talking about China, if we're talking about security, if we're talking about the economy or tech. So I think it depends a little bit on the issues, but there is a potential for to be disrupted also within internal unity. I mean, it could also lead to the other side, which is everybody wraps their minds around that we really need to do this together. We are alone in the world, and so we just. But I don't see that one as so clear cut as a potential for some disagreements among Europeans. But I think Yannis wanted to raise his finger. Yeah.
Yannis.
Yeah, I think that adding to what you were saying, Ricardo, I think the level of unity among the EU27 currently and over the past 2 years, at least, has already been rather low. We're pretending that we're very united, but if you, in the beginning, you had to scratch a bit deeper, now you only have to scratch the surface, you will see all the differences among member states. Look at the defense fund discussions which we're having. Look at other discussions where there are huge differences between and among the EU27. So my prognosis would be that in case, again, not saying that will happen, but in case there is a Trump 2 administration coming in place, that they will put even more strains on our unity. And it will put especially strains on our unity when it comes to geopolitical concerns. And geopoliticals matter. There is a difference whether you are someone who's living in the Baltic countries or whether you're someone living in Portugal. Geopolitics do matter. And I think that the chances of unity being even more under pressure than it has already been with a Trump 2 is rather high, I fear.
And there is from Joanna English from our audience, also related to that, saying, will we see a shift of power and influence from Western Europe towards Central and Eastern European countries, and what impact might this have on policy priorities? I don't know, Ricardo, if this is something briefly the paper has looked into.
No, I mean, we did not look, but I think, I mean, what you see from Eastern Europe, I think, is a lot of the moral leadership in the problem, for example, on Ukraine. But we see that the spat that we're currently observing between France and Germany still determines the speed on which some of these things will be done. So I think, okay, there is much more attention being paid to what is being said at the East, and rightly so, but I'm not sure whether it is as influential as we would actually, as I would even wanted it to be.
Okay, just one very final couple of Parliament questions, really quick answers. Jarno Hartikainen says, how do you see the prospect of a centre-right coalition in the European Parliament, meaning the EPP deciding to cooperate with the ECR and Greens and maybe leaving the Liberals out? And a question from Andrew Duff, who is your candidate for Commission presidency if von der Leyen fails to secure the 361 votes she needs in Parliament? You might want to think about that one. I might come back to that one right at the end if we have time. But is there the different formulas, the different ways the coalitions could be formed? Any thoughts, Yanis, on that?
You mean the coalitions within the European Parliament?
Within the Parliament, yeah.
I think that there will be still an attempt of the mainstream parties, especially if the right-wing parties, as we all assume, will do well, that they will try to get their act together. However, having said that, I think that we already see that there are inclinations, especially in the center-right, EPP, to increase their level of cooperation with right-wing forces. I don't think that this will be systemic. However, I think there is a structural push, and it's also, by the way, a way of putting pressure on other traditional parties close to the center. So it's politics being played out. However, I think there are limits to that because it has an effect also at national level. Because if there's a stronger systemic cooperation with right-wing parties, that could have a negative effect on debates we're having at national level. Like in Germany, let's not forget, Weber is German. How do we deal with the AfD? Just one small remark
but we need to move on.
On the shift of power between East and West. I think that this is a very old and narrow discussion which brings us nowhere. If there is leadership or not, that is the question. And if the leadership comes more from one part of the continent or from another part or from links between the different parts, that is what matters. It is important that we have leadership and not whether we have a move towards more to the east or to the west or the south or the north. These are debates, I think, which we had in the past and we should leave behind us.
Let's come back to the EU geopolitical role. And Ricardo, I wanted to come to you because you've talked about, I'm quoting you here, learning the language, that you say the EU maybe is learning the language of power, but unlearning the language of influence. What do you mean by that?
I mean, I think it's a little bit of a reflection over the past 2 years or even more. I mean, okay, there is an assumption that I make that the EU before was influential, and some people sometimes contest this idea. But anyway, assuming that the EU was indeed influential, has been influential in the past, I think the issue that we have observed is that even, while the EU is building up capabilities, has stepped up in response to Russia's aggression on Ukraine, I think it is very clear for everybody that we have been unable to, for example, to bring, let's say, the so-called global South around to also see that Russia's aggression is not only a problem for Ukraine principally and for Europe, but it's for the world at large. I think we have not been able to make that case. I think as we become a geopolitical actor, being a geopolitical actor also means making choices, means that there will be trade-offs. It means, for example, on energy security, that we cannot only rely on democratic energy suppliers. We need to rely on all of those that will be out there that might be reliable, and some of them don't have the right, let's say, democratic or human rights credentials. But nevertheless, we might need to be more transactional. This will have a cost in our soft power because we are becoming, let's say, a power player, so to say. So I think, but this is a reflection that I believe that we are not really having. I think some of the discussions that we were having having before, if there is a lot of also fragmentation within our political systems, inability to forge consensus, that will undermine our influence. Although we might be more powerful, although we might have more instruments to really to assert our positions, we might be less influential. And I think this is something that we need to wrap our minds around.
Thank you. Let me turn to Ukraine, and Fabian, come to you on this. We had a summit of European leaders hosted by Emmanuel Macron earlier this week. Broadly, I wanted to ask if you think the EU is doing enough at the moment, and what the consequences will be if the US Congress can't agree on support. Can the EU step in and fill that gap? And we have a question from Dong-Young Kim, a diplomat in our audience, who says, how do you foresee the political and military conflicts and differences within the EU and NATO regarding President Macron's mention of the possibility of sending troops to Ukraine? He said, we need to do whatever it takes for as long as it takes, and didn't rule this out. And Dong-Young Kim asks, what do you think are the strategic implications of what he said? And do you think this was about changing his approval ratings? Do you think it was linked to the European elections? Or is this him, I'm adding this part to the question, trying to step into that vacuum that we see emerging in the US? Fabian, how do you read where we are and what the EU can do if the US doesn't step up to the plate anymore?
Well, let me make 3 points. Firstly, I think it is incredibly difficult to be in a situation where the US, despite having a very supportive president, is unable to get the further support through the system. That does not bode well for the future, and I think it is something we Europeans collectively have to consider. That even if we don't have a Trump 2 administration, that the US will not be able to step up to the plate, which leads me to the second point, which is the absolute and obvious need that the Ukraine army in particular, but also the government, needs more support. And it needs to have that support much more quickly, and in particular we have to be able to address the shortage of ammunition, which is at this very moment hindering what Ukraine can do on the battlefield. So the Europeans have to step in. They have to step in already, and they have to plan how we can step in the longer term. And that leads me to my final point, which is that unfortunately, what we are also seeing is that we are not coordinated, that we are not actually doing it in a way where we have decided, and I'm coming back to that again, strategically, what are the kind of things we need to do, and then talk about who's going to do it, how are we going to do it, what are the kind of guarantees we have to give to ammunition producers, etc. Instead, we get initiatives which are very often more rhetoric than reality. And then we get counter reactions from other member states. And we've mentioned Macron here. We almost immediately had a counter reaction from Scholz, which said something very different. And it just shows that Europe has not been able to get together and make that strategic determination, where is it we want to go.
Just to be clear, Fabian, when you say rhetoric versus reality, do you put Macron's remarks down there in the rhetoric camp, or do you think he's serious when he says whatever it takes?
I think for me, this is very much about rhetoric, but that's not necessarily a negative thing. I mean, rhetoric is also about giving signals. It's about making sure that others understand the level of determination which is there. But the problem with that is if that then is immediately undermined by other European countries, then it backfires, because ultimately what Putin hears is that we're not united and that we're not determined.
Indeed. Yanis, how do you read what Emmanuel Macron said and the reaction, as Fabian said, from Olaf Scholz and others, and where we are now?
Well, first of all, I think that Macron is motivated by different factors. obviously it has something to do with internal politics, with the fact that he is weak at the national level. He also wants to show strength at the European level, portray himself as a leader. He also used the whatever it takes moment. That was an analogy he made, which was obviously no coincidence. So I think that there are a number of motivating factors. But I think the key point is that what the reaction to it had been, because this was obviously a non-concerted effort, undermined what he was trying to achieve. And it just is showing what Fabian was saying with respect to the strategic myopia which we have, where we are not able to overcome our differences, where not only are we not united, but there's also distrust vis-a-vis each other, which obviously, if it's this distrust between Berlin and Paris, plays an even stronger role, as Ricardo was reminding us earlier. So I think the underlying reasons of why we saw what Macron did and the reaction to it are the ones which I worry more about, rather than why did someone say what he said and how the reaction was to it, because it just tells you a bigger story. And here Fabian is right. Seeing it from the side of the adversary, this is a sign of weakness, and one can assume that he will be trying to push us and test us how far he's ready to go with us and how we react.
And on disunity, Ricardo, if I can just briefly turn to another point, which is the situation in Gaza. And the Outlook paper does talk about rebuilding the EU's credibility in the Middle East after what it describes as the debacle that followed the Hamas terrorist attack of October the 7th on Israel. What do you think the EU can do, should do here to rebuild that credibility?
I mean, I think the EU, let's also face it, the EU has never had, and here I go to the influence, has never had much influence over what is happening in that part of the world. Unfortunately, although it puts a lot of, let's say, money into the region to try to at least support Palestinians. But I would say that really, I think all the foreign policy freelancing around that question that happened right after the terrorist attack and then with the war, I think there has been, I think leaders were able to put a stop to that, but the EU member states continue divided. So I think what we need really now to do is to play a constructive role. First, I think it's a two-state solution. This has come back. The Middle East peace process, as the saying goes, behind doors, there is no peace and there is no process. And I think we need to resume an effort into the peace process. I think the EU needs to play, now that Aspide's mission in the region is also now has been sort of created. I think we need to, through the Aspide's mission, play a constructive role in the region. I think anything that you can do that is constructive, that is supportive to peace, and that tries to bring sort of the parts together. So even I know that Mr. Borrell's peace plan was very much criticized, but it's an effort. I think it's better that we are talking about peace and trying to bring peace to the region and also to the humanitarian disaster that is ongoing in Gaza. So I think it's on these things that I believe that we should play a positive and constructive role.
Thank you. If you'll forgive me, Yanis, Fabian, I'm not going to come back to you on that issue because we need to turn, and I want to come back to what you said would be one of the central planks of von der Leyen II Commission presidency, namely security and defence. And this question about whether, we have often discussed this on Outlook, and we discussed how serious the EU is or is not about stepping up its security and defence capabilities in the current context, and whether it's really thinking long term. We've had this week, of course, also NATO and Sweden, but we had Sweden finally, Hungary voting in favour of it joining, and then we had the remarks from Trump about the future of NATO. Do you think, Yanis, the EU is finally serious? And can I throw in a question from EmanuelMacron into this, who says, when we talk about a European Commissioner for Defence, something you mentioned earlier, I think it was Fabian mentioned earlier, it is currently not very clear what this commissioner's portfolio would be. If it's just a commissioner for the defence industry, this might be a missed opportunity, says EmanuelMacron, for the Commission to have more concrete influence on the security and foreign agenda if member states remain responsible for operation and deployment, for example. So how you see this portfolio, what it would be. But are we finally taking this as seriously as we need to? And if we are, what needs to happen?
I think in order to answer that question, you need to define of how serious the situation is. And I think the discussion we've had over the past 15 minutes shows that it is a very serious situation, that the volatility is enormous, that the uncertainties are enormous. They are linked to the situation in Ukraine. They're obviously also linked to how the developments in the US will be. So all the things we have discussed about. And I think that if you take that into account in terms of what we actually need to do, the level of our response is meager, is not up to what we actually need to do. Now, you could say, you can ask yourself whose fault that is, also linking it to the question of the Commissioner for Defense. I wouldn't put the blame on the Commission. It's not that the Commission would not want to assume more responsibility, a stronger role, coordinating role, whatever it might be at the European level. It's the fact that member states do not want that to happen. It's the member states who want to keep their prerogatives when it comes to security and defense. After all, these, at the end of the day, is issues of life and death. So they want to keep this in their own hands. And as I said earlier, as there is distrust among the EU27, cooperating more with each other is something which you are hesitant to do if you distrust each other. Now, and this is not the story of the last 1 or 2 years, it's the story of the last decades. So this is not actually new. I think when you will see actually more cooperation when it comes to defense is when the pressures increase. Now, you could argue, are the pressures not already high enough? I would say yes. My lesson from the 24th of February 22 is that the pressure is enormous. And we should have already, from that moment in time, done much more when it comes to security and defense, and we're not doing it. What we're doing is meager. Also, if you look into the not only the actual cooperation, also in defense industry, it is not increasing substantially. If you look into investments, we're talking about millions instead of billions. And when there are ideas about doing something along the lines of next generation EU in the defense area, I wonder as to whether this will happen if we have discussions about how we will find the money we need in order to support Ukraine over the next 5 years, and we need 2-3 summits in order to get to a solution. So I'm just saying that in terms of what the level of ambition needs to be compared to what we're doing, we're not living up to the standards we should be living up to.
So, Fabian, should the focus be on that cooperation, what the defense community likes to call pooling and sharing? Should it be on increasing the spend? The Danish Prime Minister said this week we must step up and scale up the defense industry. She said, and we have to have a discussion with our populations. We haven't paid a price for our freedom for the past 30 years. What do we need to do? And do you think if the Commission focuses solely on the defense industry, it's missing an opportunity, as per the question from our audience?
I think the key here is it's not either or. Clearly, there is a lot of work which has to be done in the defense sector. There has to be the ultimate paradox in the current situation is, and we've known this for a very, very long time, that it's not just about how much you spend, it's how effective you spend it. And as long as we are going to be as fragmented as we are in the defense sector, our efficiency of spending is extremely low. But it's also about coordinating, for example, a response to the pressures from the US. What are we going to do in the defense and security sector in case of Trump 2? What does that mean for NATO? What does that mean for the cooperation? So there's a big agenda there which needs to be addressed. But the reality, and this is where Yanis is absolutely right, we still are in a world where what dominates the response at the national level, and that's in all countries, not just in the ones we often blame, but in all countries, there are national taboos over which the countries do not want to step. And that means that we are nowhere near as decisive as we should be. I mean, we're back to what we've called the progress illusion, that we're still trying to address exponential challenges with linear policies.
Thank you very much. Ricardo, a quick reaction to that if you want, but I also, in the last 5 minutes we have, want to come back to what you talked about at the beginning about the emerging trend of securitization, something that your paper looks at and warns of the risk of the EU turning increasingly inward and becoming increasingly defensive. You say it's a natural response to the weaponization of issues like trade, like energy, and so on. But what does it mean for the EU's global role? I also want to draw the audience's attention to there's another paper you should take a look at on economic security, an EPC paper published earlier this month that called this question of our economic security Europe's make or break moment. Do take a look at that if you can. But how do you see this emerging trend across all the different policy areas? And is it inevitably a negative if the EU looks inward more, or is it inevitable given the situation? Ricardo.
Thank you, Jack. I mean, just a quick reaction,
Yeah.
particularly, I think, on NATO. I mean, there's a great contribution also from Jamie Shea on the Outlook paper on NATO at 75. So look into that, because he also explores some of the uncertainty that could come from a Trump presidency and so on. I mean, I think on security and defense, I think the challenge that also us Europeans face at the moment is that there are things that we need to do immediately in the short term, and that's support to Ukraine. And then there's the long-term planning in terms of acquisition capabilities and all of that. And that, I mean, that requires a plan. That requires setting a strategic goal, as Fabian was just saying. So I think this is something that there is still to be done. And also we know that there are practicalities to it. I mean, you can't just go on the shelf and buy these things. You know, you need to plan for them. So okay, you can go into the market to buy ammunition, and you can go beyond just Europe. But if you're talking about great, other capabilities, this needs to plan in the long term. I mean, for the securitization, I mean, I think again, this was the intention is very much that we have a reflection that it's very natural that a system that tries to protect citizens or tries to safeguard, our policies builds up security or builds up in mechanisms that we can be better protected after, so many years of weaponization of so many mundane things, from paracetamol to energy to, you name it. So I think that's a natural reaction, but we do need to think that a more protectionist EU, if it comes to that, a EU that is looking more inwards, that is trying to build up walls to, for example, to keep people away and so on and so forth. Is that really the model? Is that the appropriate model in terms of international relations? Because again, this is also very much a paper about foreign policy. So are we trying to engage with the world as we close ourselves into a sort of a very try to build a safe space, so to say, for us. So I think it's this dichotomy, there are these paradoxes. And again, we can just then go probably to the trade-offs, and there will be trade-offs to be done. But I think what it's better is that we do them by planning and not by accident.
Thank you. Fabian, a word to this, and particularly this issue of economic security and why I know it's an area of a lot of focus of EPC work at the moment. I mentioned the paper. Why is it so important, and should we be guarding against the risk of turning inward?
Well, what we should have learned from the last years, by now years, not just months anymore, but what we should have learned is that our way of looking at the world, at least in certain parts of Europe, was faulty. We did not build into the possibility that interdependence can be weaponized, that interdependence also means vulnerability, that it's not simply a positive aspect. And that was in part because, in a sense, economic interdependence is really what the European Union is built on. So we thought this could be applied to the rest of the world. We should have learned earlier that this isn't the case. Certainly, we should have seen that when Crimea happened. But in any case, it just now means that we have to take it far more seriously. And what we have called for in the EPC is really a paradigm shift, that we really have to think about this, but it does not come without a cost. Security, including economic security, is a public good. And a public good has to be supplied by someone, has to be paid for by someone. And that is the debate we're not really having at the moment, is who's going to bear the cost for that? how can we minimize the negative impacts it has, for example, on our openness, on our exchange with others? How do we communicate about this with citizens, but also with the rest of the world? Because it is also affecting developing and emerging countries in a very negative way.
So that remark on a broader sense of the Danish Prime Minister applies, this discussion with our populations. Yanis, a very brief one, and then in a sentence I'm going to ask you, and I'm not sure whether Andrew, when he asks who the candidate for Commission President, is saying who would you like or who do you think would be likely if she didn't get the majority. I'll leave it to each of you to interpret it, but I'm going to ask you if you will play the game for a name and why. But Yanis, a brief one on this question of securitization, if you would.
I think I'm going back to the quote you mentioned from the Danish Prime Minister. We need this discussion with our populations. We need an honest discussion, I would add, and we need a transnational discussion. Because if we actually want a European response, we cannot only have national debates about these challenges. What I still often hear is that we cannot afford politically to confront our people with the harsh realities. And I think this is a huge mistake. And it's playing actually in the hands of the populists. And when we have an honest debate, we also need to have the courage to admit our mistakes. That is not easy because it might be perceived as a sign of weakness, but I actually think it is a sign of strength if we admit of where we have gotten things wrong and then say what we want to do in order to counter what we have done wrong.
Thank you. Okay, as I say, you can interpret this as a who do you think is politically most likely if she fails, or who you'd like, but in one name, one sentence. Ricardo.
I mean, if it's still EPP, I would say Roberta Metsola.
Okay, Yanis.
It will have to be EPP, because if we've gotten to the point which Andrew is referring to, we have found an agreement on the entire tableau, which will be extremely difficult to find that tableau. So we will have identified that it had been EPP and a female. So you have to look for EPP and a female. And I would look especially towards Eastern, Central and Eastern Europe then.
Okay, thank you very much. I see not a name, but a region to go to. Fabian, you have the last word. Your name, why?
I won't give you a name either, but I will just simply say, just because we cannot agree on Ursula von der Leyen would not mean that we could agree on anyone else. So I think the biggest danger is actually that you end up with a complete mess where you don't have any kind of agreement, any clear candidate going forward.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Andrew for the question. Thank you, Ricardo, for playing the game. He's looking despairing that neither of you took up the challenge, but your analysis of what the challenge is, very valid. Thank you to all of you. There were more questions. I got lots in, couldn't get them all in, but thank you very much for all those great questions. Just to mention again, those two papers, the Outlook paper published last week, the paper on economic security, you'll find both on the EPC website. Lots of publications coming out and in the pipeline, so do keep an eye on that, and some events to watch for. Tomorrow, an event on the Green Deal and the poly crisis, aligning short-term reactions with long-term commitments, something we touched on in our discussions. A breakfast policy briefing next Tuesday on justice for Ukraine, holding Russia accountable for its war crimes. And next Wednesday, looking at the run-up to the US elections, where do things stand? And we will be back with another update after the EU summit in March. So, gentlemen, thank you so much. Great discussion as always. Wish we had twice as long. As always, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye. See you.